I never imagined my own mother would look me in the eyes and tell me that my life was worth less than my sister's. But there she was, standing in our family's living room, her hands clenched together, as if holding back her frustration. "Ethan, you're her only hope," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "Without you, she won't survive." I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach twist. My sister, Claire, had been sick for months. Liver failure. The doctors had exhausted every option, and now they were saying a transplant was her only chance. A transplant that required a donor match. A donor that, unfortunately, turned out to be me. I didn't want to refuse. I loved Claire. She was my little sister, my childhood companion, the person who had always looked up to me. But I wasn't just being asked to donate a piece of myself. My mother was demanding it, as if my consent was just a formality. "She needs a piece of your liver, not all of it," my mother pressed, her eyes glistening with tears. "You'll recover, Ethan. But if you don't do this, she won't." I glanced at Claire, who sat quietly on the couch, her face pale and thin from the illness. She wasn't saying anything. She didn't plead. She didn't demand. She just watched, her expression unreadable. "Mom," I said finally, my voice heavy with the weight of the moment, "I need time to think about this." My mother's face darkened. "There's nothing to think about," she snapped. "Claire's life is more important than your hesitation." Those words hit me like a slap. More important. As if my life, my health, my fears, none of it mattered in comparison. I turned away, unable to face her disappointment any longer. I needed to clear my head. And I needed to understand why Claire, the one person who should have the most to say, remained so silent. I stepped outside, letting the cold evening air bite at my skin. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The weight of my mother's words pressed down on me, suffocating in their certainty. Claire's life is more important than my hesitation. I wasn't a selfish person. I wasn't heartless. But something about the way my mother had framed it, like I had no choice in the matter, made me uneasy. I needed to talk to Claire alone. When I returned inside, my mother had gone to her room, probably exhausted from the emotional battle she had just fought. Claire was still on the couch, wrapped in the same oversized sweater she had been wearing for weeks. The illness had made her smaller, more fragile. She glanced up as I sat beside her. "You're quiet," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. "Mom practically threw herself at my feet, but you haven't said a word." Claire smiled faintly. "Because it's your decision." I frowned. "Is it? Mom doesn't seem to think so." She exhaled slowly, staring down at her hands. "I know this is huge, Ethan. I know it's not something you can just decide overnight. That's why I haven't begged." She hesitated, then looked up at me. "I want to live, but not at the cost of forcing you into something you don't want." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were so unlike my mother's. "You don't agree with her?" I asked carefully. Claire shook her head. "She's scared. She's desperate. She sees me wasting away, and she's trying to control the only thing she can. But Ethan," she hesitated, then lowered her voice, "if you don't want to do this, I won't hold it against you." I swallowed hard. Why did hearing that make it even harder? I had expected Claire to beg, to cry, to tell me she needed me to save her. Instead, she was giving me the one thing I wasn't sure I could accept, a choice. I nodded, unsure of what to say, and for the first time in days, we just sat there, the silence between us speaking louder than words. The next morning, I woke up with the same heaviness in my chest, the kind that didn't go away, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. I went through my usual routine, brushing my teeth, making coffee, staring blankly at my phone without really reading anything. But no matter what I did, my mind kept circling back to the same thought. Claire needed me. and my mother had made it clear that saying no was not an option. I could hear her moving around the kitchen. She was already on the phone, probably updating family members about Claire's condition. I didn't want to go in there. I didn't want to hear her voice and feel the pressure pushing down on me again. Instead, I grabbed my keys and left. I needed a neutral perspective. Someone who wasn't emotionally entangled in all of this. That's how I found myself at Jake's apartment. Jake had been my best friend since college. The kind of guy who could make any problem seem smaller just by talking about it. He opened the door, saw my face, and immediately stepped aside. "All right, let's hear it," he said, flopping onto his couch. "You look like someone just handed you a live grenade and told you to hold on to it." I let out a hollow laugh and sat down. "It kind of feels that way." He listened as I explained everything. Claire's condition, my mother's ultimatum, Claire's quiet acceptance of whatever I chose. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, then leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Well," he said finally, "that's heavy." I shot him a dry look. "No kidding." He exhaled through his nose. "Look, man, it's your liver. Your body. No one gets to tell you what to do with it, not even your mom. She thinks Claire's life is more important than my hesitation." Jake scoffed. "Your hesitation? Like having your body cut open and a chunk of an organ removed is just some minor inconvenience." I ran a hand through my hair. "I know it's a big deal. But if I don't do it, Claire could." "Yeah, she could," Jake interrupted, his expression serious. "And that's awful. But let me ask you something. If you weren't a match, what would your mom do then? Would she be telling the universe it was unfair? Would she be demanding someone else step up, no matter the cost?" I hadn't thought about that. Jake leaned forward. "And another thing. If this was the other way around, if Claire was a match for you, do you think your mom would force her to do it?" That question hit me harder than I expected. Would she? Or was this only different because I was the older one, the responsible one, the one who had always been expected to keep things together? Jake sighed. "Look, man, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. But I am saying you should be sure it's what you want. Not what your mom wants. Not even what Claire wants." "You?" I nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling into my chest. I still didn't have an answer. But for the first time, I realized I had the right to ask the question. I didn't go home right away. I needed time. Time to think, time to breathe, time to exist outside the crushing pressure of my mother's expectations. Instead, I found myself at a quiet diner on the edge of town, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The world outside moved on like it always did, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Eventually, I had no choice but to return home. The moment I stepped inside, I knew my mother had been waiting for me. She stood in the hallway, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Where were you?" I sighed, shutting the door behind me. "Thinking," she scoffed. "What is there to think about?" My jaw clenched. "A lot, Mom. It's not a small thing to have surgery, to give up a part of my body. I needed time to process." Her expression darkened. "You don't have time. Claire doesn't have time." I glanced past her to the couch where Claire usually sat, but she wasn't there. "Where is she?" "She went to bed early." "She's exhausted, Ethan. Her body is failing." "And you're out thinking?" Something inside me snapped. "Do you even care what this is doing to me?" I asked, my voice sharp. She flinched like I had struck her. "Of course I care. That's why I need you to do this. You're her only chance." "No, Mom," I said, shaking my head. "You need me to be the perfect son. The one who always does what he's told. The one who sacrifices without question." Her eyes filled with anger. "How can you say that? She's your sister?" If the situation were reversed, she wouldn't be forced into this choice. I interrupted. You wouldn't demand it from her the way you're demanding it from me. Silence. For a moment, I saw something flicker across my mother's face. Guilt, maybe. But just as quickly, it was gone. I can't believe you're hesitating, she whispered. I thought I raised you better than this. I let out a bitter laugh. You didn't raise me, Mom. You raised Claire. I just grew up knowing I had to take care of myself. Her face paled. That's not true. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. I need some air. I didn't wait for a response. I just walked out, leaving the weight of the house behind me. And as I stepped into the night, I realized something. This wasn't just about Claire's health anymore. This was about my place in this family. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be the son my mother expected me to be. I walked aimlessly through the dark streets, hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets. The cold air stung my face, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. I had always known, on some level, that I was the afterthought in our family. Not because my mother didn't love me. No, she did in her own way, but because Claire had always been her priority. The sick child. The fragile one. The one who needed protection. And I was the strong one. The dependable one. The son who never asked for much, who never caused trouble, who was just there. Until now. I wasn't sure how long I wandered before I found myself back outside my house, staring up at the windows glowing softly in the dark. I wasn't ready to go back in, but I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The house was silent, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. I made my way toward my room, hoping to avoid another confrontation, but the moment I passed the living room, a voice stopped me. Ethan. I turned. My mother was sitting at the dining table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her face drawn with exhaustion. Sit down, she said softly. I hesitated. I didn't want another fight. But there was something in her voice, something almost broken. Reluctantly, I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a long moment, she just looked at me. Then, with a deep breath, she said, I don't know how we got here. I let out a tired laugh. Really? Because I think it's pretty obvious. She flinched, but nodded. Maybe I pushed too hard. But I don't know what else to do, Ethan. She's my daughter. My baby girl. And she's dying. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, I saw the sheer desperation behind her anger. I know, I said quietly. I know how much you love her. But you're acting like I don't matter. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I'm not saying you don't care about me, Mom, I continued, choosing my words carefully. But when it comes down to it, you've always put Claire first. I get it, she needed you more when we were kids. But I guess I thought that at least now, when it's my body on the line, you'd see me as more than just a way to save her. She stared at me, her lips trembling. That's not fair. Isn't it? I leaned forward. If I wasn't a match, would you be looking at me like I failed you? She sucked in a sharp breath. That's not what this is. Isn't it? I repeated, my voice bitter. Because that's what it feels like. Silence. For the first time in my life, my mother had no response. After a moment, I pushed back my chair and stood. I need sleep. I turned to leave, but then I hesitated. Mom? I said without looking back. Yes. If Claire were the match for me, would you force her to do it? Silence again. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I don't know. That told me everything I needed to know. I went to my room, shut the door, and lay awake for hours. And by the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. Morning came too soon. I hadn't slept much, if at all. My mind had been replaying my conversation with my mother over and over, dissecting every word, every hesitation, every unspoken truth that hung between us. But now, as sunlight filtered through my blinds, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. It was time to make a choice. I got up, stretched, and took a deep breath. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of the TV playing, but it wasn't loud. It was just background noise, something to fill the silence that had settled over the house ever since this ordeal began. I found Claire sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, a blanket wrapped around her frail frame. She looked up as I entered, and for a second, neither of us spoke. "Hey," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Hey." I sat down beside her, resting my elbows on my knees. Another moment of silence. Then, without preamble, I said, "I'm not doing it." She didn't react at first. She just kept looking at me, her expression unreadable. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "Okay." That was it. No shock, no anger, no accusations. Just okay. I frowned. "That's all?" She gave a small, tired smile. "It was always your choice, Ethan. I told you that." I leaned back against the couch, running a hand through my hair. "I thought you'd try to change my mind." Claire shook her head. "It wouldn't be right. I won't beg you to save me." And somehow, those words made me feel worse. I exhaled, my chest tight. "I'm sorry." She reached out and placed a hand over mine. "Don't be. I know how hard this is for you. And I don't want you to do this just because Mom expects you to." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Resignation. Claire wasn't just tired, she was done. She had already made peace with what was happening. "You're giving up," I said, barely above a whisper. Her fingers tightened around mine. "No," she said softly. "I'm just accepting it. Maybe this is how it's supposed to be." I shook my head. That's not. It's not your responsibility to fix this," she interrupted gently. "And it's not your fault if I don't get better." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. Claire had never once pressured me. Not like Mom. Not like the rest of the family. But that didn't make this decision any easier. I stayed with her for a long time, neither of us speaking. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just Claire's older brother. I was a person with my own right to choose. And even though I had made my choice, I wasn't sure if I could live with it. I didn't tell my mother right away. I needed time. Time to sit with my decision, to process the weight of it before I let it loose into the world and watched everything unravel. But I didn't have much time. That evening, just as I was debating whether to get dinner or skip eating altogether, my mother cornered me in the hallway. "Well?" she asked, arms folded, her entire posture bracing for a fight. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Mom, not now." "No, now," she snapped. "You've had days to think. You know how sick she is. You know, we don't have time to sit around and wait for you to make peace with it." I swallowed down the frustration rising in my throat. "I have made my decision." The room went still. Her expression shifted, eyes narrowing slightly as if she was trying to read my mind before I even said it. "Then say it," she said, her voice clipped. I forced myself to stand tall, even as my stomach twisted painfully. "I'm not doing it." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a sharp exhale. A step backward. Her hands clenched into fists. "What?" I kept my voice even. "I said, I'm not doing it." Her face contorted, first in disbelief, then in fury. "You can't be serious." "I am." "Ethan, you have to." There is no one else. Do you not understand that? I do, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. But this is my body, Mom. And your body? She hissed, cutting me off. This isn't about you, Ethan. This is about Claire. Your sister? The one who has spent her entire life sick while you got to be healthy. How can you be so selfish? That word, selfish, landed like a slap across my face. I clenched my jaw. It's not selfish to want to say in what happens to me. It is when someone's life is on the line, she shouted, her voice cracking. When it's your own sister. Mom, stop! The force of my voice startled even me. Her mouth snapped shut. I took a shaky breath. I love Claire. I do. But you can't just expect me to do this like it's nothing. It's surgery. It's risky. And even if everything goes perfectly, I have to live with the consequences. You haven't even asked how I feel about that. She scoffed, shaking her head. How you feel? Ethan, I don't have the luxury of worrying about your feelings right now. I have one child dying in the other room while the other one. She stopped herself, breathing heavily. I stared at her. Go ahead, I said bitterly. Finish that sentence. She didn't. Instead, she pressed her lips together, turning away from me as her shoulders began to shake. I had never seen my mother cry like this before. I hated it. I hated this entire situation. But I wasn't changing my mind. Without another word, I turned and walked past her, heading to my room before she could say anything else. And as I shut the door behind me, I realized something. No matter what happened next, nothing in this family would ever be the same. The next few days were tense. My mother barely spoke to me, her silence louder than any words she could have thrown my way. I had expected her to keep fighting, to try and guilt me into changing my mind. But instead, she withdrew, retreating into herself, into her grief, as if she had already lost Claire. Claire, on the other hand, remained the same. She never begged, never got angry, never tried to change my mind. If anything, she seemed almost relieved. But then, something happened that I never saw coming. It was late at night when I heard a soft knock at my bedroom door. I opened it to find Claire standing there, looking smaller than ever in her oversized sweater. I need to talk to you, she said. I stepped aside, letting her in. She perched on the edge of my bed, fingers twisting together in her lap. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, I never wanted the transplant. I froze. What? She let out a slow breath, her eyes sad but steady. I never wanted you to do it, Ethan. I didn't tell Mom because I knew she wouldn't listen. She would have fought me on it, just like she fought you. But I made peace with this a long time ago. I stared at her, my mind racing. Claire, what are you saying? She hesitated. The doctors told me weeks ago that even with a transplant, there's no guarantee I'll survive. There are risks, complications, and even if I do make it, I'll have to live on medications for the rest of my life, constantly fearing that my body will reject the liver. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They said that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. Mom refuses to hear it. She keeps telling herself that if I get the transplant, everything will go back to normal. But Ethan, I don't think I want that life. My chest ached. So you're just giving up? She smiled sadly. I'm not giving up. I'm choosing. I shook my head, trying to process what she was telling me. Mom is going to lose it. I know, she murmured. That's why I need your help. I frowned. With what? She took my hand, squeezing it gently. I need you to help me make her understand. To help her see that this isn't about you saying no. It's about me making a choice about my life. I exhaled slowly, nodding. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. Claire had been carrying it too. And together, we were finally going to put it down. The next morning, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Mom. She came downstairs looking exhausted, her eyes red from lack of sleep. The moment she saw the two of us sitting together, her expression tightened, as if bracing for another battle. "I don't want to fight," Claire said softly before Mom could speak. Mom exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "Then tell me Ethan changed his mind." Claire shook her head. "No. And he shouldn't have to." Mom's face hardened. "Claire, please." "No, Mom," Claire interrupted, her voice uncharacteristically firm. "You need to listen to me." Mom hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Claire was rarely this direct, rarely this forceful. Claire took a breath, then continued. "I've decided not to get the transplant." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. Mom's face went pale. "What? What are you saying?" Claire reached across the table, taking Mom's trembling hands in hers. "I know how badly you want me to get better. I know how hard you fought for me my whole life. But I don't want to go through this surgery. I don't want to put Ethan through it either." Tears welled up in Mom's eyes. "Claire, you have to." "I don't," Claire said gently. "Even with a transplant, I might not make it. And even if I do, my life won't magically go back to normal. I'll always be sick. I'll always be fighting. And I don't know if that's the life I want." Mom shook her head, tears streaming down her face. But you're my baby. I can't just." "I know," Claire whispered, her own voice shaking. "But you have to let me go." The silence that followed was unbearable. Then Mom broke. She sobbed openly, her whole body trembling. Claire held on to her, whispering soothing words, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as the forceful, unyielding woman she had always been, but as a mother who had been carrying an impossible pain for years. She had spent Claire's entire life trying to keep her alive, fighting for every extra moment. And now, Claire was asking her to stop fighting. After what felt like hours, Mom finally looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I just needed you to see me too." She nodded, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "I do. I see you now." For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest lifted. I didn't know what the future held for Claire. I didn't know how much time we had left with her. But for the first time, it was her choice. And that was all that mattered.